So I love Halloween, or at least I love the idea of Halloween, considering I live in Australia and it's really not much of a thing here, unfortunately. And because it's spring here and not autumn, the main way I can get a taste of the spookiness of Halloween is by watching films. However, I'm not much of a horror film fan. I don't think it's the scariness of horror films that puts me off necessarily, because there are lots of scary things that I enjoy, like Stranger Things, for example. I think it's more to do with the fact that horror films usually have sad endings, and I don't like going through all that emotional trauma throughout the whole film just to also get more emotional trauma at the end. I'm sure I'm generalizing horror films a lot, and there are still plenty that I've enjoyed, but I thought I would make a list of non-horror films that will give you those Halloween spooky vibes. So first up, in no particular order, is Corpse Bride, which was directed by Tim Burton. So this is a stop-motion animation film set in a sort of quasi-Victorian age English town, and it is about a character called Victor who comes from a middle-class family who are running out of money, and they have arranged to marry him to a girl called Victoria, who is from a very old and wealthy family, or at least each family think that the other one is wealthy. But what they don't know is that both families are marrying off their children in the hope that they are marrying their children into money. Victor and Victoria have never met each other before, so of course they both have a lot of doubts about the wedding, and then something happens where Victor is dragged into the underworld where he meets the Corpse Bride. Firstly, you should know this film is a musical, and I love musicals. Danny Elfman, of course, did the music, and a lot of the songs are very much the traditional style of musical theatre in that they are telling the story and moving the story forward in a musical form. I also think the design of this film is really stunning. I should say I'm not particularly a Tim Burton fan as such. I think this is really the only one of his films that I absolutely love. I think here Tim Burton's really captured a very British sense of humour and is really delving into the melodrama, which doesn't at all take itself too seriously, and yet you still feel the real emotions of all the characters. There's also just something about stop motion that I think really lends itself to the Halloween and general Christmas period. I guess because it has that nostalgic factor of watching those kinds of films when you're a kid. Next on my list is E.T. This is such a quintessential Halloween film because it is set at Halloween. I'm sure you all know that E.T. is about a little alien who arrives on planet Earth and somehow finds his way to the house of Elliot, a young boy. This is a film that was obviously one of the biggest inspirations for Stranger Things. It perfectly encapsulates that 80s children's film era of kids riding around on bikes in neighborhoods and just having the total freedom to go wherever they want without their parents seeming to worry or needing to know where they're going. It's really not a sci-fi film at all. It's, like most Spielberg films, a story about families and about people that just also happens to include a really cute alien. The cinematography really stood out for me when I watched this as being one of the best parts of the film. Being set in LA, it doesn't have that traditional autumn setting you would expect from Halloween, which I found particularly relatable as it looked a lot more like an Australian Halloween. Next, I've got what I kind of call a light horror film. It is Pride and Prejudice and the Zombies. I have not read the book version of this. I think I read the first page and was like, this is just exactly the same as Pride and Prejudice, but with some zombies copy and pasted into it. I only watched the film because my sister had already watched it and said she thought it was hilarious. So I said, alright, we'll give it a go. And she was right, it is really, really fun. The film version of this story has probably been changed around a lot from the book. It does not follow the exact same story as Pride and Prejudice. It obviously includes most of the same characters and all the same elements, but it's definitely created its own kind of world, which I love. This totally got panned by critics when it came out, but I think they were missing the point in that this is not a film for horror fans or a film for fans of zombie films. It is a film for lovers of Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen. There are so many little jokes in it that you would only get if you'd watched Pride and Prejudice adaptations or if you've read the book. I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, there is one scene where Mr. Darcy jumps into a pond for absolutely no reason. The film also stars Lily James as Elizabeth, who is just great casting regardless of what kind of Pride and Prejudice adaptation you're making. And then Mr. Darcy is played by Sam Riley, who is probably best known for being the Crow friend of Maleficent, but he is an actor who's been working in Britain for ages now, and I think he's amazing. He has the best voice. He in real life has a northern British accent, but of course he's doing sort of a posh British accent in this film, but his voice is just so deep. It is incredibly lovely to listen to. Matt Smith plays Mr. Collins, which is again amazing casting. Lena Headey, who's Cersei in Game of Thrones, plays Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and she is amazing. The casting all around is just quality, and they all just seem to go for it in every aspect aspect of the film, both the comic and the drama aspects, as well as all the action. Everyone is totally taking it seriously while also knowing that it's the most ridiculous film ever made. Next, I want to recommend the 1940 Alfred Hitchcock adaptation of Rebecca. Pretty much any old black and white kind of spooky themed film would work to get you into the Halloween mood, I think. Likewise, any Alfred Hitchcock would probably work as well, but I particularly love this film when I watched it a couple of years ago. So Rebecca, as you know, is based on the book by Daphne du Maurier, and it is about a nameless protagonist who meets the charming gentleman Maxim de Winter while she's working as a lady's assistant in Monte Carlo. When he asks her to marry him, she is of course like, why not? I've got no other prospects. But of course, when she arrives back at his stately home in England, she discovers there is some mystery around the death of his previous wife, and the creepy housekeeper Mrs. Danvers does not like her at all, and so the protagonist is desperate to find out what actually happened to his first wife, Rebecca. While I of course think the book is better than the film, I think this film really does a great job of capturing the youth and naivety of Mrs. De Winter, as she's only known, while still making her a really likable and sympathetic character. The character of Mrs. Danvers is especially renowned from this film. She goes creeping around the corridors of this big house, barely blinking. I think the black and white really lends itself to this story as well. Anything in black and white feels a little bit extra spooky. Next on my list is The Addams Family, specifically the 1991 film. I've never seen the original Addams Family, so this and its sequel are my only experiences of that story. But what I love about this film especially is that it just encapsulates that very 90s American family film from an era when films for children did not pander down to them as much as children's films seem to do now. What The Addams Family does is it's created this family of very strange people who on the surface seem like they would be vicious and scary and cruel, and yet they are a family who genuinely care and love each other and support each other's interests. You've especially got Morticia and Gomez as parents who genuinely love each other, which is of course in direct contrast to the way a lot of married couples are portrayed on screen. And while this film does have a plot about someone pretending to be their Uncle Fester to try and infiltrate their way into the family, really what's so fun about it is the costumes and the sets and the funny script and all the actors being great. Halloween to me is such an American celebration, even though I know it did start out in Britain, and there's something in this film that just seems to encapsulate everything that I think about when I imagine an American Halloween. The next two films are not just films that I love to watch around Halloween, they are genuinely two of my favourite films of all time. So first we have What We Do in the Shadows, which is a film from Taika Waititi before he did Thor Ragnarok, so before he was like super famous. He also made it with Jermaine Clement, who is one half of Flight of the Conchords, and both of them also star in the film. It is a mockumentary about vampires living in Wellington in New Zealand. It's not exactly something that you watch for the plot. It honestly just seems to be Taika and his mates having a blast. The jokes mainly arise from the fact that although they are these scary vampires, they are all incredibly ridiculous people, and they mainly quabble about things like whose turn it is to do the dishes in the house that they share, and whether they can get invited into the cool nightclubs in Wellington. It is that classic type of comedy of very ordinary people who just happen to be in an extraordinary situation and just who happen to be vampires. What I love about the film is that apparently there was no script as such. Taika and Jermaine didn't let any of the other actors see a script. They improvised everything and apparently had hours and hours of raw footage that they very cleverly edited down into a 90-minute film. You will find yourself by the end being completely in love with these vampires and actually getting quite emotional about some of the things that happen. Everything about it has such a distinct aesthetic. The music, the set design, the costumes, it all looks very vampiric and spooky, but is also hilarious and not at all scary at the same time. Finally, one of my favorite films of all time is Coraline. This is another stop motion animation film, and this is from Leica Studio, who are very well known for doing particularly exquisite animation design. This is based on the book by Neil Gaiman, and I've read the book, but I think I actually prefer the film. This is about a girl called Coraline who moves into a new house with her parents. She's not particularly happy about this. Her parents are too busy to entertain her, so she goes exploring and somehow ends up in an alternative version of her house where her other mother and her other father live. The only difference between them and her real parents is that they have buttons for eyes. And basically a lot of really scary stuff goes down. Genuinely, I think this is probably the scariest film on my list. My sister bought me a fan art print from Etsy. I'm so obsessed with this poster. It has so many little things hidden in it that are part of the film. This is one of those films where I'm like, if I was to make a film, I'd want it to be like this. There's something so beautiful and subtle about the characterizations, and the story at first feels quite meandering and you're not really sure where it's going, and everything is so beautiful, not just the visuals but the music as well. And then when stuff happens, it just suddenly ramps up the tension. It is also incredibly fun as well, and there are so many quirky characters. And I also love that the main relationship is between a girl and her parents, but especially between her and her mum, which is a really lovely relationship for kids to see in films, I think. So those were my recommendations for films to watch at Halloween. If you also have any recommendations for non-horror Halloween films, please let me know below in the comments. I hope you have a great Halloween. Bye!